Methodology of Humanities, Module 3, Narration and Representation. Narration is found everywhere in our everyday life. Narration or storytelling is universal. It can be found everywhere and is intensely present in all human proficiencies. It carves a deep structure into our minds, and it is essential for us as food is essential or oxygen is essential for us to live. We tell stories, and telling story is interesting. So we have to analyze the ways of telling stories. Every story would be having a narrative structure. So to understand ourselves, we have to analyze the structure of stories. We are attracted towards stories. We are familiar with our folk stories, folk songs, ballads of our locality, or even from other cultures of other worlds. We get different stories every day. Even in newspapers or in television channels, we have stories. Even news would be appearing in the form of a story. Or even otherwise, we would say, what is today's lead story? So, story is there everywhere in our life. We encounter stories in our everyday life. So, stories are very much significant. Stories of the world are innumerable, numberless. It is there in plenty. It is present in every age, every place, every society, every time. There is no community or social group without stories. Stories tell diverse lifestyles, culture, tradition, religions, age, and ethnicity of each social group. All classes and human groups have their own stories or narratives, which tell stories of their culture, and stories are representations of life experiences or their portrayal of life. Or one can say, stories build up our life itself. Stories construct our life. We live in stories. No one can live outside story. When we tell stories to others, we are telling about ourselves. Stories are not always cooked up stories or built up stories or mere narratives or imaginative reconstructions, because the mere act of telling something would be part of storytelling. So, story is not something that is unfamiliar to us. Story is very much familiar and it is very close to us. So, an analysis of the structure of a story is very much important. Narratology, there is a term. Science of narratives was coined by Todorov, the French critic, in 1969. Narratology was initially familiarized by the structuralists in the 60s in the West. But currently, it has developed into a variety of theories, concepts, and theories on narratology play a central role in exploring our ability to produce stories, narratives, in a multitude of forms, mediums, and contexts, in the form of stories, songs, drama, films, or even newspaper stories. Narratology is not only reading and interpretation of individual stories, but it attempts to study the nature of story as a structure involving cultural and social interaction. Andrew Bennett and Nicholas Royal offer 5 propositions in the discussion of narratives. 1. Stories are everywhere. 2. Not only do we tell stories, but stories tell us. If stories are everywhere, we are also in stories. 3. Telling of a story is always bound up with power, property, and domination. 4. Stories are multiple. There is always more than one story. 5. Stories always have something to tell us about stories themselves. They always involve self-reflection and metafictional dimensions. Stories are everywhere that we have already discussed. In our everyday life, we come across different types of stories. In films, in television news reading, in newspapers, or in our everyday lives, in the public sphere, when we come across people, they tell stories. And also in story books, we have stories. We have stories in poem. We have stories in fiction. Everywhere we can find the presence of story. When we tell stories, the stories would tell about us. What type of a story that we are telling? If I tell a story about a king and a queen, it will tell about me as well. Why should one always tell stories of kings and queens alone? We would say once upon a time there was a king, and the king died, and the queen also died because of grief. And we would wonder why one always tells stories about kings and queens. And the question further can be extended: why the king dies? And even when the king dies, why the queen also dies out of grief? So, telling stories is not as simple as we think. Stories are not as innocent as they appear. So, we have to analyze. When a king dies and the queen also dies, there are two genders involved in it, the king and the queen. So, an issue of gender is inherent in it. Questions of power is there. We speak always about kings and queens, those who are in power. So, power is, of course, a topic that is to be discussed when we speak about stories. Power, property. When we tell about kings, we would say that he is a ruler of a kingdom and he has domination. He is an emperor, if suppose the king is having some control over other kings. We would say he is an emperor. So domination, of course, is there. But telling stories is not simply telling stories. It tells about the speaker and also the listener. What type of a story that a particular audience would like to listen to. Because stories are interesting. They can seduce us. They can trap us. We will be listening to stories for hours together. We will be watching movies just to know at times the storyline. So it's interesting, it's captivating. Then stories are multiple. There is no single story about a particular event. When something occurs, something happens in our society, different stories will be built up around that event. The same event would be told by different people in different contexts, in different ways. No two people would begin a story alike. They will have their own thrusts, focal points, angles. A man and a woman, for example, would tell the same story from different angles. So those stories are universal. No story would be read alike by people of different parts of the world. Even when we read the same story, we get different stories out of it. Or there is no final story given to us by a particular speaker. When we listen to a story, we are contributing a little bit and constructing our own stories based upon our own experiences. When we listen to a story about a girl in her kitchen, Cinderella, for example, we won't be able to imagine a situation, a Western situation, a Western kitchen, where the girl is situated. We never know the dress code of the girl. We never know the type of kitchen, utensils. Cinderella, the story, as it is very much familiar, would take us to a hearth and an oven where there would be some amount of cinder. But in our most modern kitchens, we don't have such ovens now, such hearths now. Instead of cinder, we have cylinder in our kitchens. So, a different version of Cinderella can be constructed, narrated, told by the new gen girls, and the title of the story can be Cinderella instead of Cinderella. So, the geographical differences, the cultural differences, the contexts would determine the content of the story. And why should always be girls alone in kitchens? Can be another question. Can't there be boys? Of course, boys also would be there in the kitchen, not for taking food or washing dish, but for even preparing food. They are expected to go out of the kitchen and go to the market and bring whatever items are required for preparing food. And girls are expected to cook what the boys bring back to their home. But in these types of stories that I tell now, some issues of gender are inherent. So, telling stories of our everyday life would be having these kinds of different dimensions. So, narrative is to be looked at from such things. We never distinguish story from a narrative. We think that stories and narratives are synonyms for one for the other. These two words are used for two distinct concepts or purposes. Narrative theory precisely defines the difference between stories and narratives. There are different types of stories. In epic, we will have one story. In tragedy, we have another story. In comedy, we have another story. And drama and epic, they have different stories, different narratives, I mean. Short stories will have a different narrative. A short story is different from a story. Story was there right from the beginning of human interaction. People living in society, in groups, would be telling stories right from the very early beginning days of human existence. Short story is a different thing altogether. It's a new invention, a new genre. Poetry, of course, also tells stories in a different way altogether. In this context, narrative implies a process of grammatical structuration within a language. When we think of story, we never think of the grammatical structuration within a language. Narrative in addition to being an object of scientific analysis, would be used to tell stories about stories. What makes one tell story? Story is considered an unformulated concept consisting of events to be depicted. In a story, there will be so many events narrated. We never think about the narrative structure of a story when we listen to a story or when we tell a story. Narrative entails showing or telling of these events along with the mode of expression. All narratives moves in a linear manner from the beginning point of a story to its end. Generally, it is just a sequence which starts and moves inexorably to its end. But certain stories can be told in a different way. From the middle, a story can be begun and we can come back to the beginning part in flashback. Or we can go forward or backward in stories. Or there can be stories which are cyclical in nature.